Chapter 16 Sally's Goodbye. Melissa. By the time my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2001, I had been in contact and working with Aralam for about 12 years. Mom knew nothing about my connection with Aralam or any of the work that we had done with people. I had never shared it with her. I was terrified of sharing it with her. She knew that I was sensitive in a psychic way, but she did not have any idea who I really was as a grown person, and she certainly did not have any idea that I was working and writing with a channel named Aralam. I think that one true regret I have as far as my relationship with my mother goes, is that she never truly knew me. I could not let her see who I truly was in this lifetime because she was just brutal and judgmental about so many things, or I perceived her to be. She was not stable, and it was just never something that I felt I could divulge to her. My relationship with her was, for the most part, what I still refer to as tap dancing. I only let her see what she could handle, or maybe what I could handle. You might say that I was making that decision for her, but trust me, at the time, if I breached her line of comfort, she would let me know immediately. This was just the reality of her. Now, years later, I have to take some responsibility for her not knowing me. I was a coward, and I should have just been who I was with her, and I didn't. I was just too scared of her. Even as a grown woman, I was just scared of her. With Sally, as long as you did the interpersonal dance that she expected to see from you, with no curves or changes, you might be okay for an interaction or two. She could not and would not brook any kind of free thinking, free will, or boundaries from my sister and I even into full adulthood. I was trained to be hypervigilant to her needs at a very, very young age. In order to survive, you had to be able to know what was going on with her emotionally at all times. She absolutely refused to respect any kind of emotional, physical, or intellectual boundary. To this very day, I struggle with having healthy boundaries. We were not allowed to have any thoughts, feelings, emotions, or movements to ourselves where she was concerned. You just were not allowed to have any emotion or thought even begin to creep its way onto your face or into your body language that she was not reading, judging, and digging at, real or imagined on her part. It was exhausting. As a result of all that, as an adult, I really never went down School Street to visit her unless there was some holiday, party, or event which my absence would have been noted. I was a diligent daughter in that I did not leave her fully alone, but I would not engage her if I didn't have to. It was just too damn exhausting, and because I was grown and a mother myself, I did not have the ability or energy to tap dance correctly for her anymore. She knew it, I knew it, and somehow it made us both sad. It was, I think, like the very end of a long marriage where the combatants love each other, but they just don't care anymore about trying to make it right by one another. That is where I was emotionally in 2001. I loved my mother, but I just could not do it with her anymore. I couldn't. The Creator God hears these things as they run through your mind. You know, the God hears everything sentiment, from my experience, is truth. My mom called me at work one afternoon in the late spring of 2001. It was late May, I think, because I can remember the smell in the air of moist, damp earth and pending greenery. She wanted me to come have a drink with her after work. I had not seen her in a while, even though we lived in the same small town. She kind of begged me to come down for just a couple. She sounded different than usual, which made me say, "Sure, I'll stop after work," much faster than I normally would have. She had divorced Bill at this point and was living with a man 20 years younger than she, who had gone to school with my sister. To this day, I believe that she knew she had cancer and threw her whole life away in order to sort of sow some wild oats. She felt she was running out of time, I think. Later that afternoon, I arrived at my mom's house after work and she was mixing drinks: coffee brandy, milk, and vodka. 2 shots of coffee brandy, 2 shots of vodka, and a splash of milk shaken in a big green glass. I walked into the kitchen and she was standing on the far side of the counter. I think it was a Tuesday, and she was dressed and ready like it was a Friday night from 1979. She always liked to dress up a bit, but she was wearing skinny jeans, a lot of jewelry, makeup, and her hair was done. She looked good in that cougar kind of way that people refer to. She was overdressed for drinks with me on a Tuesday, and I had not really ever seen the look that greeted me on her face before. I was a professional at reading her mood, but this face I could not read other than to say it was not good. She seemed, for the first time in decades, like an 8-year-old girl who was really scared. She seemed fragile, helpless, and vulnerable. I was totally unaccustomed to seeing or feeling this from her. As was my training from childhood, I was trying to determine via body language, energy, eye movements, and a myriad of other things just what her mood was. Erlam tells me that this hypervigilance learned in my childhood was actually some good, if not painful, training for later being able to hear him for channeling. I guess it was a kind of a boot camp for psychic awareness. I know now that there are many less painful methods of training your senses. Before I could fully figure out what was going on with her, we both took a big, long pull from those double, might I add, White Russians that she had mixed up. That alcohol hit the back of my throat, and I have to admit it tasted so sweet and good. It was the taste of home for me. It was the taste of Mom. To this very day, if I really want to remember what I can carve out as good from my mother, I will have a snifter of Allen's coffee brandy. I just sit, drink it, and listen to ice clink in the glass. I don't even put milk in it. I just drink it straight. That experience, even now, makes me so melancholy for her presence, even though her presence was often so painful. It is a very strange sensation to miss a person who was so brutal to you most of the time. I was just enjoying that sensation when she said, "Melissa, I have something on my chest that I want you to look at." Without hesitation, I got up from the kitchen counter and followed her to the bathroom. In the bathroom, she pulled her right shoulder out of her low-cut top and exposed her upper breast and collarbone. What I saw was sort of indescribable and was what the oncologist would later describe as only seen textbook photos from the late 1800s. My mother stood there looking up at me while I looked down at a silver dollar-sized open wound on her chest. The wound was somewhat concave and looked as though there was living molten lava on the inside. It was as if there was some kind of growth that was not skin, not bone, not fatty or muscle tissue. The growth on the inside almost looked crystallized in some way. The spot was oozing and glistening. It smelled a bit like hamburger that was going bad after a bit too long in a broken refrigerator. I had a hard time not gagging or making the face that people make when they are horrified beyond words. It was as big as a small plum, and it had broken the skin on her upper chest. It was like something from a movie. It was large, and she had been keeping a bandage on it to keep the oozing under control. On some level, I knew physically that I was looking at cancer, which had been left to its own devices and had broken the skin in an eruption. For the first time since I had held her head in my hands when I was 10, while she cried about a lost love, my heart broke for her. I looked at her, looking up at me. She wanted me to tell her that it was a rash. She wanted me to tell her it was just a weird patch of skin. She wanted me to tell her that it was going to be okay. Mom wanted me to be the parent that she had never had. She wanted me to tell her that we would get it fixed up, no problem. The problem was I knew better, right down to the core of my bones. I knew that this was not just going to go away. Tears started to roll down her face, and I held her. I asked her how long it had been there and how it started. She said, "Well, it started as just a little lump under the skin, like the pencil lead or a grain of rice." "Mom, how long ago did you find that little lump?" She replied, "About 3 years ago." I wanted to scream at her. 3 years ago? Are you fucking kidding me? You have watched this grow into your body and break the surface for 3 fucking years? But I didn't say any of that. I knew it was too late for that. I just held her and stroked her head like a little child. Something inside of me finally broke for this woman. I heard and felt something inside me break. I can't tell you what it was, but I know that it broke and would never be the same again. There is something so visceral about love. For a million reasons, I knew I should not give one shit about this woman who had abused me. She had been miserable, mean, brutal to me for most of my life. Alcoholism, mental illness, meanness, craziness, controlling, bipolar, and raging with strange jealousy, but she had also loved me in some way. And in that moment, looking into her eyes, I was so hurt for her. She was such a broken human, and she was my human, and she was so damn broken. The other issue for me was that Aralam had told me so many times that we choose our parents in order to learn lessons from each other. I held her and we cried. I told her that it was going to be okay and that we need to call Sissy and we need to get it looked at. That's all. We just need to get it looked at. We called my sister. Mom couldn't talk to her, so I did. Mom sat at the kitchen table drinking her White Russian while Stephanie and I made plans for her to come to Chester right away. Sally sat at the kitchen table looking out into space past the front porch on out toward the swinging footbridge which spanned the Williams River. I told Steph I would call her when I got home. I told her I loved her. I told her I would see her in the morning. Mom's boyfriend came home from work and we finished our drinks as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I called the last doctor that my mother had seen about 5 years earlier for a throat infection. The doctor was a really nice lady who had a clinic in Springfield about 10 miles away from Chester. She agreed to see Mom at 1 p.m. that day. Steph was on her way over from New Hampshire and was going to meet us there. When I picked Mom up, she was kind of overdressed again. It made me so sad to see her all dressed up, too much. I think it made her feel like she had her armor on, like she was in control. I was driving a really old Land Rover at the time. We drove the 10 miles without talking much at all. Mom was scared. I could see that she was, but she was being very quiet and almost angry that she had to rely upon me in this way. Sally had never gotten her license. She had, for my whole life, been completely dependent upon others to get around. When we first pulled into the clinic, she would not get out of the truck. She just sat there, looking back now. I wish that I could have been more loving and softer with her, but I was just so jaded to her insanity that I could not make sense of her suddenly needing me. I was being good to her, but in the way you might be good to a wild animal that you find on the side of the road who's been injured. You want to help, but you're also scared of being bitten. When she finally got out of the car, she was visibly terrified. Sally did not ever go to the doctors. She literally had sworn them off years earlier. We sat in the waiting room, and I filled out her paperwork for her on the clipboard while she directed me. Because this was just a preliminary family clinic, the waiting room was full of tiny children and pregnant women. This was not any kind of specialized office. This was literally just a strep throat kind of place. Finally, when Sally's name was called, we stood up and went into Dr. Stern's office. She was glad to see Mom and said, "Sally, I'm so glad to see you. It's been way too long." And then she said, "Okay, let's see this rash that you have." When Dr. Stearns pulled the pad off the wound on my mom's chest, the look on her face was something way outside of professional. She said, "Sally, I wish you had called me sooner." She looked up at me accusingly, and I said, "Mom just showed this to me yesterday for the first time." "Well, Sally, I am going to need to have you see Dr. Karat later. He's a specialist in this kind of thing, and this is just way past my specialty." My mother looked at her and said, "It's a rash. I need some cream." Dr. Stearns was so sweet. She grabbed my mom's hand. "Sally, you know this is not a rash. You need a specialist for this. You should have come in sooner." She ushered us out to the front desk and made a phone call herself. At that very moment, Steph walked in with her 2 little baby girls. All of our eyes came together at once. Dr. Stearns was on hold, waiting to speak to Dr. Karat. I could hear her almost yelling at his secretary, "No, I need to speak with him now. I am sending my patient to his office in the next 5 minutes, and she needs to be seen today. Please let him know that and have him call me as soon as he gets out of his appointment." She hung up the phone and hugged my mother. "You will like Dr. Karat, Sally. Do as he recommends, please." She hugged Mom, sister, and I. "Melissa, keep me in the loop, please." "I will, Dr. Stearns." I will never forget the look of complete pity that she had on her face as she watched the 3 of us with those 2 little girls leave the waiting room. When we got to the parking lot, it was warm and bright and springy sunlight was everywhere, and Mom broke into tears. "I am not going to that doctor. He is an oncologist. I do not need to see him." She was getting pissed. Steph, Mom, and I sat down on a picnic table that was across the parking lot on the lawn and sat there. Mom cried, and finally I said, "Mom, it won't hurt to go see the doctor." Steph's two little girls were playing in the grass while we sat there. Steph was crying and holding my mom, and I was literally trying to come up with what the strategy was going to be for getting Mom 2 miles down the road to the oncologist's office. It felt to me like having a tiger in the back seat of a Volkswagen Bug, trying to figure out how to get it down the road to the vet without getting killed. We all sat in silence together for minutes, a long time. I can't tell you how long. Finally, I said, "Mom, let's just go see the doctor. Chances are it's not a big deal." She agreed. I think that at that point, Steph and I were both so emotionally sideswiped by the sudden emotional turn that our relationship to this woman, our mother, was taking. Mom was so mad, she climbed up into my old truck and we rode the few miles down the road in silence toward Dr. Curat's office. Sister followed in her car with the little ones. Dr. Curat's office was clean, quiet, and filled with people who were there for various levels of cancer treatment. On the way into the office, Mom was muttering about how she did not need to be here with these people. I just ignored her and told the nice lady at the front desk that Dr. Stearns had sent us. I will never forget the woman behind the desk. She was a girl that I had gone to school with some years earlier, and the look she gave me as she scanned between me, Mom, and Steph was what I can only assume is the face that the women who are loaded into boats to escape the Titanic were given their men when they were being left behind. If pity and sorrow have a definitive face, that was it. I hoped that Mom did not see it. Dr. Curat was from India. He was just about my mom's age, I think. He was probably 53 at the time. Mom and I followed him into a small room where he just looked at the both of us. He said, "Sally, I'm glad that you're here, but I talked to Dr. Stearns, and I am not sure what, if anything, I can do for you at this time." I looked at him and thought this was the worst bedside manner that I'd ever seen in my life. Mom stood up and was ready to leave. "Wait," I said, "don't you want to see it?" Mom was standing and tears were running down her face. It was so terribly surreal. The doctor was like, "You're screwed. You're done. I don't need to see it. Go home, you stupid woman." He didn't say that right out, but that was the gist of his speech. He looked at both of us, looked up at Mom, and I could read on his face that he was mad at her. He said, "Sally, let's have a look at what you have here. You have children, yes?" He began to unwrap the bandage, while talking to her all the while about how he could not understand why she did not see a doctor when she first found the tiny bump. He talked to her about her children. He told her that he knew that she was a smart woman, and he could not understand why she had waited so long to get the wound looked at. All the while, he was taking one of those wooden sticks that doctors use to poke at a skin tumor or a wart to be removed, and poked at the wound. He was poking it. The outer skin of the concave growth was breaking open a bit, and it basically smelled like rotten dead meat. It did not seem to hurt Mom, and she was not answering his questions, but simply looking past him out the window. I will never forget that because it was like she was seeing something amazing out that window, even though it was frosted completely over for privacy. I did something then that would become the only thing I knew how to do from that point onward. I grabbed her hand and I gripped it firmly. I just held her hand. Well past the point of it being awkward, I held it well past the time when I think she wanted me to. From that day forward, Steph and I just started holding her hand whenever things got really rough or really scary or just plain unmanageable, and they did, often. Dr. Curat broke my mom's stare when he said, "I need to biopsy this and I'm going to do it now." She immediately started crying and protesting. I squeezed her hand tighter and said, "Mom, it won't be a big deal. It will be fast, over, just like that." She looked at me, angry, aggressive, and then resigned. "I want you to come in with me." She looked at the doctor and said, "I want Melissa to come in with me." He agreed, and we went back out into the waiting room. About 10 minutes later, the nurse came back out and led us to the room at the other end of the building. It was a small operating theater, but the tools were all still from what I would say the late 70s. Clean, serviceable, shiny, and sharp. The operating table had that shiny black covering that dentist chairs had in the 60s. It looked like a movie scene in a way, and although it was post-2000, I could not help but think it looked scarier than it needed to. Mom was physically shaking with fear. She would not take off any of her clothes except her shirt, which Dr. Curat did not like, but agreed to. He laid Mom on her back and began to lay cover and tape all around the outside edge of the wound. He applied a strong spotlight to the area and then began swabbing acrid-smelling bright orange Bacterize all over the site. I was holding Mom's hand and sitting on a stool directly across from the doctor. It occurred to me that I might faint or dry heave, but I didn't. I kept my face devoid of emotions. I realized that Mom was looking directly at me, and I needed to hold that face so that she would be okay for the biopsy. I was holding the kind of face that Civil War nurses gave a soldier right before the morphine kicks in as a doctor saws off a limb. It's a totally fake expression of happy non-concern, but the face holder and the expression receiver does not care, as it is meant to keep a calm facade in the face of pain and horror. Dr. Curott picked up a 3-inch scalpel, brushed it with Bactrin, and began to cut away the raisin-sized bites at the growth. Mom started to silently cry, and then she began to moan in a low keen, which finally ended in an open weeping. I held her hand and cooed at her like she was a small child. I kept telling her that he was almost done. After what seemed like a chasm of time, he said, "Okay, Sally, I need one more sample and we will be done. You're doing great. I know this is painful." I have never seen anything like the tissue that he was removing from her body. Later, this doctor would pull me aside after a surgery to remove the growth from my mom's right breast and say, "You know, Melissa, most people have not seen this kind of cancer break the skin and grow since the late 1800s. I had not seen this in 25 years of practice since my med school days in books, and the only reason that they showed us these photos was on the odd but slim chance that we would see it in person. I wish that your mother had come in sooner. I found a lot of metastases in her lymph and lung. We will talk later about that when she's awake." After the day of the biopsy, Mom only gave permission to have the lump removed. She would not agree to any other treatment of the cancer that had been growing in her body for more than 4 years. We would find later that she had cancer in her lungs, brain, breasts, and spine. She was offered treatment, which the doctors told her would give her 10 years plus from her time of diagnosis, but she declined. She was 53 years old and decided that she was not going to have any treatment at all. Those next 3.5 years were filled with a strange knowledge that she was dying, but we were not allowed to have any opinion on the lack of treatment. She acted as if nothing were wrong with her, and that included going back to her same old emotional and alcoholic issues. She never had any kind of epiphany that Sister or I saw. My sister and I just agreed between ourselves that she was going to decide to leave the earth in this way, that we would just stand and hold the space for her to do so. She was brutal to be around on many days, and it was exhausting. We held her space anyway and simply waited with her as she drank, smoked, and emotionally wrestled her way toward her own end. She leaned into her addictions with her diagnosis, and yet had another reason to do so. For the next 3.5 years, my sister and I did our best to respect her wishes. After she'd had the growth removed from her chest wall, she did not want to talk about the cancer at all. She absolutely would not talk about any of it. In the days just after the surgery, I received a barrage of calls from various doctors and medical professionals who wanted to know why she was not going to get treatment, saying she is so young and she has so much to live for. After a month or so, those calls stopped and life with Mom went back to the general modus operandi that it had always been. She would become violent if anyone even asked her, "How are you feeling?" In my case, I felt like at least once a month I should ask her if she wanted to at least talk about treatment or options maybe. She was not interested in speaking about the situation at all. Looking back now, I think that her life had been so fearful and painful that the diagnosis was almost a relief to her in some strange way. I think it was her way of saying, well, this is where I get off this fucked up ride. The mental illness, alcoholism, and ruined relationships, I think, had become too much for her. She spent her life, I think, trying to seem normal when she was struggling every day. The cancer seemed to be her out. So, as the months passed, Steph and I did our best to just pretend that everything was normal. She would have it no other way, but in doing that, she was, I think, sort of let loose to behave even more badly than was her normal boundary. She became so out of control, emotionally abusive on certain days that it was hard to be around her at all. It was a brutal situation. Over those 3 years, the cancer spread completely unabated by any kind of intervention, and due to that, certain facial features and physical aspects manifested. I know that for me, one of the hardest to see was that Mom's left eye seemed to change shape and become a bit protruded. She acted as if nothing had changed and just applied more makeup, which was so difficult to watch. Steph and I were always expected to see her in the light that she expected, but now her need for us to confirm that she was looking good or really sexy was just so heartbreaking. Her breathing was becoming very labored in that last year as well, and she would just keep saying that she had bronchitis. She would make us go through the whole conversations about how my bronchitis is bad today, Melissa. I think you should pick me up some cough syrup for it. If I did not confirm for her wholeheartedly that she had bronchitis, she would become enraged. Finally, in the winter of 2004, I was worn out by it, and I just didn't see her much between March and May. I could not hide the fact any more that she was obviously just growing sicker and sicker without wanting to comfort her in some way, and she would have none of that. So I stayed away for a few months until her live-in boyfriend at the time came to me at work early in the morning and said, "I think you should call your mom. She didn't get out of bed today. She says she has the flu from her bronchitis." It was 7:30 in the morning on June 20th, 2004. I was in the process of planning my son's graduation from high school party for that coming Saturday night, and I'd been thinking about taking that Friday off from work. I picked up the phone, which hung in the production room of the salsa company I worked at, and I called her. When she answered, I could tell that something in her had shifted hard. She was abnormally out of breath, even for her, and she said, "Melissa, I think I've picked up a flu bug, which is making my bronchitis worse." I asked her if she needed me to bring her anything from the store, and she said yes. I would like some wonton soup and some ginger ale, maybe. Wonton soup and ginger ale were always our family's go-to for any kind of illness, hangover, or discomfort. So I said, "I will bring it to you at lunch. Do you want me to come hang out with you for the afternoon?" I asked her this very carefully because usually if I showed any sort of concern about her, she would get mad. On this day, she said, "Yeah, that would be nice." "Okay, I'll come over at lunch. We can watch some TV if you want." When I hung up the phone, I knew that something had changed for her, and I knew that the life clock that we all live by was suddenly moving its big hand for her. My stomach knotted, and I just stood there with my hand hanging on the phone. I picked the telephone back up and called my sister. When I arrived at Mom's house, I had to let myself in. She was lying on the couch, coughing hard. I walked in with the groceries, dropped them on the kitchen counter, and studied my facial expression in a mirror before I walked into the living room. She looked so much worse than I had remembered from seeing her just weeks earlier. She had lost more weight, and her facial structure had changed even more around her eye. I cheerfully said, "Hey, I'll make you some soup." She said great and went back to watching TV. We sat on the couch for some time, her coughing hard and drinking and eating a bit. It was Monday afternoon by now, and I was not sure what to do. I felt like I should stay there with her overnight, although she had not asked me to, and I knew better than to bring it up. At about 5 p.m., she said, "Melissa, I think I want to go back up to my bed for a rest." I helped her up to her bed and said, "Hey, why don't I stay tonight in case the flu gets you up in the night and we won't have to bother Billy." Billy was her live-in boyfriend with whom I worked at the salsa company. She looked at my face as if she was searching for even a hint of sympathy or worry in my expression. When she saw none, she said, "Yeah, that might be good if you don't mind." "Of course not," I said. "I'll see about getting some dinner." That was the first time I had seen my mother not have a drink in the evening, and it was pretty much the last time she ever got up out of that bed again in that little 1786 house on School Street. During the following 5 days, over 75 people came to that little house on School Street in Chester, Vermont, to say goodbye to my mother. Sally had 1,000,001 friends throughout her life. In those final days, they all came through to say goodbye to her, and she presided over the celebration for the most part from her bed as the grand dame of the occasion of her leaving the planet. The whole week-long party was facilitated by my sister, myself, our grandmother Peggy, and my dear lifelong friend Linda, accompanied by a large bottle of cherry-flavored liquid morphine. People stopped day and night to sit at Mom's bedside and talk about whatever their life connection had been with her. Flowers, food, bottles of booze, candles, plants, cards, letters, and jewelry were all brought as what seemed like offerings to a kind of queen. The truth is, although Sally could be brutal, crazy, angry, out of her mind, and a very difficult person as a parent, she was at the very same time dazzling, artistic, loving, charming, terrifyingly psychic, and empathic when she wanted to be. She was the glowing commune leader. She was the life of the party. She was, I assume from the long list of lovers past and present who showed up to pay homage, a memorable lover as well as having a pirate's ability to drink anyone under the table. She had accumulated a large cast of family, friends, ex-husbands, partygoers, sycophants, and believers who all wanted to hold her hand and say goodbye. It was truly a 5-day procession of a celebration of a truly complicated and gorgeous soul's imminent departure. My sister and I played the consummate host to this final week-long party as we had always done in our lives for Mom. The procession lasted well into Friday night of that week, and then on Saturday morning, it trickled to just the final few family who were there on the train platform to see her off. Throughout the whole week, I had been talking with Aralim about her final leaving of her body. I wanted to know if he was going to alert me when the time was upon us. He told me that in her leaving, I was going to be witnessing something that would later be written into this very book that you are reading. I trusted that he would let me know what was happening with her. Sister and I had been sleeping on the couch together for the whole week, and it was hard. Mom was upstairs in her little room taking long, raspy breaths, and we were getting up every 2 hours to give the morphine for pain. I could not tell you what part of her was actually hurting, but by the end of her life, we knew that the cancer had moved to her brain, bones, spine, lungs, and facial structure, so I assumed she just hurt all over. At about 3:45 a.m. on the 27th of June 2004, my sister and I laid on the couch in the dark downstairs. We were both unable to sleep and talked about how hard it was to sleep now as adults in Mom's house. This was the same house that we had grown up in, but there were so many really terrifying memories that it was even still hard to sleep there. We talked and cried and held hands until about 4:45, just pre-dawn, when my mom's boyfriend came downstairs and said, "You girls might want to come up and check on your mother. She is breathing pretty badly." We both jumped up in a kind of exhausted stupor in the pre-dawn light and headed upstairs. When we entered the room, Aralim said, "It's just about time for her to fully come over. I'm going to let you see some parts of it, and when I tell you to let go of her hand, you must do as I say. It is not your time, Melissa, so you must let go of her hand when I direct you to." I silently agreed. Mom was lying in the dark with a small nightlight on, and some light starting to peek gray into the room from the window at the end. Sister laid down on her right side, and I laid down on her left. We all three lay on our backs. Mom's breathing was very labored, and her breaths were coming very slowly and with long intervals in between. She did not speak to us or open her eyes at all. We all lay there on our backs. For a moment, I caught Steph's eyes, and we both silently cried and grabbed each other's free hands over Mom's body. I mouthed the words, it's okay," a couple of times to Steph, and we lay there, the two of us, Mom between us. Laying there in the pre-dawn light, Aralim came to me and said, "Her soul is going to be leaving over the next 20 minutes or so, and I want you to see it happening. I am going to let you see it, but when I tell you, you must let go of her hand. It is not your time to leave, and although you may feel compelled to, you cannot follow her." I agreed again. I will not lie, I was stunned in so many ways at what was going on. My heart was breaking and opening for her all at the same time. In the next 20 minutes, as my sister dozed on the right side of Mom, I witnessed the following. Directly above the bed and encompassing the whole roof, a dark blue, white, and opal swirl of energy began to open. It looked something like a reverse vortex of water going up into a drain. All around the edges, fuzzy, almost watercolor painting, looking beings in long robes began to appear all around the edges. Each of them was holding out their hands and holding on to the next, creating a circle all around the outside of the vortex. Aralim told me that there were 35 or 40 of them. These beings were called healing soul transfer facilitators. He said that because Mom had lived such a difficult journey in this life, she would need to have a comforting rest time for her soul when she passed over. These facilitators were constructing a kind of soul cocoon for her when she arrived. I think I must have been holding Mom's hand a bit hard because I was stunned at what I was seeing and feeling. There was an indescribable feeling of reverence for these beings and the energy they were emitting. Mom's breathing was becoming more labored beside me, and just as I noticed this, a thin, blue-white, sparkling line of energy began to float like some kind of electrical web from her breastbone up into the vortex above the room. It was as if this silver cord was being sucked up into the vortex slowly and rhythmically, emptying her body. Aralam said, "You are witnessing her soul leaving her body and being safely caught in her rest space." Tears were rolling down my face in rivers, and it was not just from the loss of Mom, but from the profound energy coming from the beings catching her soul energy. As her soul continued to move upward, the vortex of the cocoon changed colors and radiated with what looked like soft pink heat lightning you can see when it's humid in the summer sky. At some point, I realized that the cocoon seemed to be holding more of the light of Mom than was left within her body. I heard her breath soften and slow markedly. I turned to her and could see physically that she was almost gone. The energy light that makes a person them was almost gone. As I looked back up at the energy vortex above us, the beings were sort of beginning to pull the cocoon around the edges like a sack being pulled shut. I could feel the tug of the pull myself, in my body, in my own soul. Aralam said, "Let go of her hand, Melissa." I couldn't at first. It was like being a little child when your parent or grandparent has your hand crossing the street. You sort of can't let go of the safety of that feeling. It's like a lock. You know you are loved and safe. Again, Aralam said, "Melissa, you need to let go of her. She needs to go, and it's not your time." As he said it, the beings turned just for a moment and looked at me. They actually looked directly at me, and I felt nothing but the vast expanse of love that is at the core of our universe. As they looked away, I let go of Mom's hand. At that very moment, the whole of the energy vortex opening began to pull its way above the bed and disappear. At the same time, the sun had come up outside the little window on School Street, and as I turned my head toward Mom, I could see and feel that she was gone. When I say gone, I mean that everything that had made Sally Ann Crocker light up in this world and be was gone. I touched my sister's arm on the other side of Mom, and her eyes opened. We held hands over Mom's body while she took about 15 more long, labored breaths in her final 10 minutes. She was gone, and the memory of her soul leaving this world would change my view of it for the rest of my life. I believe now that her most precious gift to me was letting me see her soul leave the planet. I had literally been allowed to see and feel her go. Aralam tells me that when a soul leaves a human body to cross over to the lobby or back home from where we come, that soul can leave in a number of different ways. In my mother's case, she needed to have a rest period. She had lived through a painful death and endured a life of an emotional, psychological, addiction, and psychic pain as well. She was received in a way that was comforting and restful for her soul. At the time of her departure from this earth plane, she needed some energetic care, almost in the way a person might go to an ER at a hospital. Her soul was literally tired out from the painful learning journey she had been in within this lifetime. From that day forward in my life, I was no longer afraid of death in the same way. I am in no hurry to have this life end, but I am not in any kind of fear about what happens when it's time to go. Aralam has always said that the whole crux of the Creator God's Earth School is about how well you live your life, learn your lessons, and then cross back over. My mother's soul stayed in that protective cocoon for about 4 Earth years after her death. I would often check in with Aralam about her progress with the healing. With that experience, I learned that birth and death are just gateways back and forth for our souls to grow, learn, and experience love. There's no actual end to any of us. I am forever indebted to this lovely, brutal, gorgeous, terrifying soul who was my mother for letting me see this in the most concrete sense. Her passing freed me from one of the most visceral fears that humans deal with, the fear of death. Now I am sharing her experience with you. Fear not. You are a loved soul.